When creating a photo montage, if you want it to look photorealistic, which is the standard that we're going for here, there are a lot of things you have to consider when you combine images together. If the images were shot in the same location, with the same lighting, same perspective, it's really easy to combine things. And planning out your shots to make that as easy as possible, it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes you're taking objects from different environments and introducing them into a new environment. And when you do that, you have to pay attention to a lot of things to make it look like it belongs there. You need to adjust the lighting of either the background or the object that you're bringing in. Adjust the color contrast so it looks like the same color light. Make sure the object is being lit from the same direction as the lighting in the scene. You have to make sure that the perspective looks right, as well as a number of other things like depth of field. If you have a scene where there's a close focus and you put the object in the distance, you want it to be the same level of blurred as the other objects at that same distance. So consistency and looking at the image in the scene, making sure these things work. Together with this, you very often have to create shadows. If you have a scene where everything is casting a shadow, you look at those shadows, see what they look like, and make sure that the object that you introduce has the same type of shadow. And if you have something on a shiny reflective surface, you will have to create a reflection. So I'm going to look at shadows and reflections in this exercise. I often find people confusing how those two things work differently. I'll see someone create a reflection and it's laying on the surface of the table, for instance, as a shadow would be represented as opposed to the way a reflection works. So here we have a box casting a shadow. There's slightly shiny floor here. You can kind of see a reflection of the box. But we're going to take this box and we're going to put it on this table. Very similar lighting. This is a shiny table. In fact, to see what it ought to look like, I put the box on the table and took this picture. And here you can see the shadow of the box, and there are other shadows in the scenes, so you can look for consistency. But then there's the reflection. There's a bright light shining on the face of this box, and you see it reflected in the dark, shiny surface. Now, we're going to look at some examples here, but one thing I want people to realize is that the shadow, of course, is on the surface of the table, and it's a projection of the silhouette of the box on the surface of the table, and the shadow is actually in the same perspective as the tabletop. So if we look at the parallel lines on the table and how they're converging, the shadow would have that same type of foreshortening. The reflection, on the other hand, you see, if we look at the edges of the box going straight down, the reflection is actually in the perspective space of the box itself. Now there's a tool, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, and that's vanishing point. It's a tool within Photoshop where you actually try to find the perspective in a space. And you use it, you start out finding something that you think is a rectangle. Okay, so this is a rectangle here, and it looks like I need to adjust this point a little bit. Okay, so that is a rectangle in the perspective of the side of this box. And I can extend this down, and you see that this edge of the box matches that. And if I keep going, you'll see that the reflection is like an extension of that plane. Now there's blur because the tabletop is not perfectly smooth, and it looks like I might be a little off in my original rectangle here to make it follow that edge precisely. This one looks better. So it's almost as if I made a copy of the box itself, inverted it, and glued it to the bottom of the original box, and we're looking at that inverted box in the, through the tabletop. I have a few photo references that kind of point this out. Here we have a shadow on the floor, and if you look at the people and look at their shadow, it's in perspective, but people it's harder to see. But if you look at these vertical lines casting shadows on the floor, you see that the shadow of the parts of the window are in the same perspective as the floor itself. And the people are also in that perspective. Another example, and that's a reflection, hold on. Okay, here's people standing on a bridge with a railing, and if you look at the lines on the road and the shadow of the vertical posts, you see that the shadow of the fence and the people is in the same perspective as the road the shadow is on. Here's a picture where there's the floor and then a wall, and so the part of the shadow that's on the floor is in the perspective of the floor, and the part of the shadow that's on the wall is in the perspective of the wall. Okay, so that's the way shadows work. They're actually on the surface that the shadow is cast on. And if you look at that surface from different angles, you'll see different perspective distortions of the shadow. Now reflections, as we saw, work differently. And again, if I went into vanishing point and looked for a rectangle here, see, the lines are yellow right now because it's saying, hey, that's not exactly... Okay. Those points, it can find a perspective that fit that. As I extend this out, follows here. Looks like I'm a little off. Straighten that up a little bit. So if I extend out here, you see matches this vertical. Of course, you have to be very careful. If I continue over here, it should match these vertical lines. And this is actually a good test of that. So if I come back here, you see it's matching this vertical, this edge, this edge. I don't know, some of these aren't really precise. Okay, and then if I extend this down to the water line and then down into the reflection, it's not perfectly accurate here, but you see that I can create a perspective box here that fits the actual object and its reflection all going to the same vanishing point. All right, let's take a look at our scene. Okay, here's the box. Now I'm going to be making a shadow, so I'm just going to be copying the box over. I'm just going to take the box. I actually come back and take a look at the shadow if I want to. So I'm going to select this and I'm just going to do a copy and paste over on top of our table. Okay, a couple things. Notice immediately is in our scene the sun is coming from the left, our box is lit from the right. I did that just so we could fix that. Go ahead and with that selected, go into edit. There are different ways to do this, but there is a flip horizontal, which will do that very nicely for us. Now notice the exposure is different in these two images. If you compare it to this, you see that that's a different exposure, but we have to work with exposure of these two as they are. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mask this out. Now I could use the quick selection, but these are all straight edges, so I'm thinking that the polygonal lasso tool ought to be pretty good at getting this. That's kind of hard to see down here. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this. To make it easier to see the contour and the shadows here, it's very, very contrasty. I'm going to put a curve on here, brighten it up. I don't want to lose the edge over here, but I do want to be able to see a little bit better in here. And I'm just going to use the polygonal lasso to quickly create a selection here. You can take as much time with this as you want to get a perfect one, but I am just going to go yes, I can really barely see still where that edge is. Right, so I have a fairly good selection for that. I don't need the curves on here anymore. Go ahead and create a layer mask, and here I have the box on the table. Zoom out a little bit here. Now the perspective of this is pretty close to the perspective of the table. I don't think it is quite right. If I squashed it down a little bit, it might be a little bit closer to what the table's perspective is. I don't want to distort it too much though. There's some adjustments I could make to the box to make it look more like the light in here. One thing I could do is I could change the exposure and clip this to the box itself. If I increase the exposure, and change the gamma a little bit, I could probably get something that matches the look of the table a little bit more. So something to consider as you adjust things. I'm not going to go too far with that. So the main things we want to look at here are the shadow and the reflection. Let's look at shadow first. Now very often you can take the profile or silhouette of an object and use that as the shadow. Sometimes, depending on the angle of the sun and the angle you're looking from, those won't really match up. Here we have a pretty good match in that the sun is coming from the left, and if you're looking from the point of view of the sun, you're seeing this corner of the box, which is a very similar profile to what we're seeing looking straight on. We're seeing a corner of the box. So the profile here should make a pretty good shadow. Now I already have a layer mask, so I'm going to control click on the layer mask to load that up. This is going to be the basis for our shadow. I'm going to create a layer for the shadow. I'm going to put it underneath. I'm going to call it shadow. I'm going to fill this with black. Looks like a pretty good choice. I could pick a color from the scene. So for instance, if I took my eyedropper and looked at kind of a really dark shadow area on the tabletop itself, see what that is. So it's kind of a reddish, but still a very dark, almost black shadow. And I'm going to use that to fill. So I'm going to use my foreground color, fill. So there it is. Now the kind of distortion I want to make from this, it's going to be a little bit easier if I rotate this so that it's in the perspective. Well, basically I want this edge to go perfectly horizontally. Now I don't have a guide here, so I'm bringing down the guide just so I can see what perfectly horizontal is. Okay, something like that. Now you'll see why I'm doing that in a moment. So I'm going to click OK here. I don't need my guide anymore. I'm going to be creating a perspective distortion of this shadow, but I want this edge to be lined up with this. If I do a transformation, I've basically, by rotating it, I've changed it so that I can go in and do distortions like this, shearing, keeping this perfectly level here. Then I can go back at a pretty oblique angle, and I can also go in and do perspective with this. So to recreate the perspective of the tabletop, I can bring this in so that this is now a perspective projection. If I go back in here and free transform, I can rotate this back up so that this edge is following along here. Reposition it. Almost there. You can be very precise with these things. If you go in here to the angle, you could actually tweak those numbers and move them around. Okay, but this is pretty close to what I want. Looking at the angle of the table leg, this should have a similar angle here. So I'm going to hold down the control key. I already put some perspective on here, but now I'm just going to do a shearing of that to get an angle that matches the angle of the shadows in the scene a little bit more. I could also, if I don't want it going out as far, I can also bring this down this way. But so I've got something approximating the kind of shadow that I want. Deselect that. I can also kind of still reposition, nudge it around. One of the more important points is this corner here, where the shadow should be lining up with that. Now, shadows, so I used a color that I drew from the table. Shadows should always be in multiply blending mode. And then you can adjust the opacity of that if we want a lighter shadow. Now shadows, as we saw, are pretty dark here, but if you want to see the edge of the box, you can back that off a little bit. Okay, so that's one aspect of the shadow, is just the shape and perspective of it. If I look at the photograph I took of an actual box on the table, you see that the shadow is fairly sharp because this is sunlight, although it does blur out a little bit the farther away you get from the object. Where it's close to the object, it's very sharp. So we're going to add a blur that changes from sharp and then gets more blurred as you move away. If we go into the blur gallery, there are a variety of blurs here. I'm going to do tilt shift. Okay, so here we have lines where there's a point where it's most in focus and then where it starts to go out of focus. First thing I want to do is rotate this. Actually, I'm going to go perfectly vertical, or close to it. Maybe a little off. And I'm going to put right here at the corner where we see the blur. Now there are a couple different lines here. If we move this all the way off here, you see that this is perfectly sharp. As we move this in, you see we start seeing some blur here. At this point, you have the maximum blur, and this line here is where you start blurring. So if we have it sharp here, then we can move out here, and we can change the amount of the blur. So in this actual lighting, this should be pretty sharp. But if you have more ambient light, you'll get more of this kind of blurring as the shadow gets further away from the object casting the shadow. So I'm going to keep this fairly sharp, but put about a 10 pixel blur on there. I'm going to click OK. Okay, so now we have the shadow. It's in perspective. I chose a color for it. It's in multiply blending mode, and I did tilt shift blurring to get kind of a natural fall off. Next thing I want to do is create a reflection. Now I'm going to handle this side and this side separately. There's really no light coming off of this side of the box. And remember, reflections are light bouncing off the object, off the reflective surface to your eye. If there's no light on the object, there's no reflection. So I'm actually just going to work with this one side here. Alright, so I'm going to be making a copy of this side of the box to use as the image reflected in the tabletop. Now I have a layer mask applied to this, so to make this a little bit easier, and one thing that would make it easier is if I flattened this image so it is applying the layer mask, but I can also just hide some of the other things here. Okay, if I disable the layer mask, you see that there's still table around here. And I don't want to copy that. So I'm going to enable the layer mask, but I'm going to use the mask to help me basically cut out the part I want here. I'm going to go in and use the polygonal lasso. And out here, I don't have to be very careful, but I need to be careful about what part of the box I'm selecting here. But then down here, I can take advantage of the layer mask to do that for me. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to copy and paste, but I'm going to copy merged, which is going to copy basically what's visible here. Then if I deselect and paste, okay, so I drag that out so I can see it. And so here you see we have a copy of the image that's trimmed. Now we can turn our other layers back on. And I can work with the reflection. So I'm going to rename that. And there are a few things need to do with this. So first thing, we need to reflect it. So with the reflection selected, I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, Flip Vertically. Now you see you have the green edge, the green edges together. But the perspective, of course, is going off the other direction. This can be easily fixed if I do a free transform and use the Control key to shear this up until they're touching. And then the perspective is a little off here. If I, as you recall, the edges of the box should continue into the reflections. In other words, if I hold down the Control key and move this point here, you see I'm bringing the edge of the reflection in line with the box above. So these perpendicular lines, the edge of the box perpendicular to the tabletop, that should appear to continue straight into the reflection, as with the one over here. Okay, so that's basically the perspective we want for the reflection. And there are different blending modes you can use. This is light, so the screen blending mode is a possibility here. If I go and change the opacity, we pretty much have the light from the side of the box being added to the light coming from the tabletop. And then just adjust the opacity of the layer so that you get the right amount of light bouncing. Now, there's different amounts of blur you might want to have on here. It does get blurrier the farther away you get. This was an uneven surface, so it was actually a little blurry right at the edge here. But let's go ahead and try the same filter. Go in the blur gallery, do the tilt shift blur. Again, rotate this. This time I'm looking to parallel the edge of the box here. Alright, so I'm lining up the beginning threshold for the blur. Actually, within the box just a little bit. Okay. So because of the uneven surface, I'm going to put distortion on there and then start cranking up the blur. Until I get something that looks about right for this scene. I'm going to click OK. And there it's applied the blur. Now there are a couple different things we can look at here. First of all, we might want to be able to move these around. So I'm going to take all of these things, not the background, the reflection, the shadow, and the box, take its adjustment layer with it, try moving these around. So depending on the situation, you may have times when you have a shadow that goes off the edge of the receiving surface, or a reflection that might go off the edge of the reflective surface. And the easiest way to deal with that is to have a mask. I need a selection for the tabletop first. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to kind of roughly try to get something that matches the tabletop. Now, the ellipse should work pretty well, except that the table is rotated a little bit. So if I go into Select and Transform Selection, I can rotate this and try to get it in the same perspective as the table. Go ahead and bring that out to the top. Now, the selection should not go around the sides because there's no reflection that's going to be off the edge of the tabletop. You can't see the box from around the edge here. So this is pretty good. So there are some adjustments that might have to be made. I'm going to go ahead and go with this here. So I'm going to click OK. And this is going to be my layer mask for the reflection. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, layer masks are usually locked to the layer that you're moving around. So if I select these layers, take my move tool and move them, the layer mask is going to move with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unlock the two so that the layer mask does not move with the layer. So here you see the layer mask is staying in place, the reflection is being clipped right where I want it. The box is not being clipped, the layer mask is only on the reflection. Now we have the situation with the shadow here. I'd like to use the same clipping on that. Now I can load this layer mask by control-clicking on it, and then apply that to the shadow. Now here's the shadow layer. I can apply the layer mask to that and unlock it. So now again, when I move these layers around, the shadow is being clipped, and the reflection is being clipped, and I can position this anywhere I need to. This is particularly helpful if you're doing an animation where the box is flying in from the side, moving around. Okay, so that completes this exercise. We have an object, we flipped it, orient it to the direction of the sun, we did a little brightness contrast to make it look more like it belongs in the scene. We created a shadow that's in the perspective of the tabletop, multiply, blending mode, adjusted the transparency of it, added a blur that changes over the surface of the table. We created a reflection and put it in the perspective of the object, flipping it and making it align. Used the screen blending mode, changed the opacity of it, and applied the tilt shift blur with a little distortion as we go. Finished it off by creating a layer mask to clip the reflection so it doesn't go beyond the edge of the table, and the same with the shadow.